look at a piece from a certain book. It's called One People, Two Worlds. It was written by Yoseph, not a rabbi, but a very accomplished big Talmud Chacham scholar. His discussions, he's an Orthodox Jew, his discussions with a Reform rabbi named Amiel Hirsch. Discussions are theological. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And they're very often adversarial. It's not so important for what we're actually going to be looking at. We're looking at an one piece written by Yosef Reinman that talks about a key idea in Judaism, and that I think connects to our Ramban very well. But it's just giving a general background. This is his letter to a Reform rabbi. And keep that in mind as we're reading this, and it might give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the things he says. But I quoted a couple of selections, and please, more so than other classes for sure, please pipe up, tell me what you think about what we're about to read. I think it's going to help us connect to the Ramban's message on Pesach significantly. Okay, so dear Ami, have you ever visited anti-Semitic sites on the internet? I did when I first got my internet service, and I haven't been back there since. Once is far more than enough. Still, I don't regret having done it. I wanted to see what our enemies have to say. I wanted to know what evil lurks in the hearts of hateful men. It is astonishing. I visited about a half dozen white supremacist sites. I also peeked in on the Nation of Islam and Hamas. A real fun evening. The things they say about us would make your hair stand on end. Most of the hate propaganda is off the wall, but some of it is slick, sophisticated, and strangely persuasive. Has anybody ever done this? Anybody ever taken this exercise? It's kind of fascinating if you ever take a look. You start to see how people could be misled very easily in terms of
insidious.
Yeah. Some of it is off the wall, like he's saying. Like, for example, something that I could so easily imagine somebody being tricked into is, I remember seeing a video once of somebody showing that the Jews are responsible for us paying higher costs for our food. Because there's this kosher tax. The kosher tax. You look at any packaged food, you ever see that OU symbol or the COR? You know what that is? That's kosher certification. And it tells you what that shows that the food is good for a Jew. And these companies, they're paying rabbis tons and tons of money to inspect our food to make sure it meets their standards, and that's coming out of our pockets. It's those filthy Jews that are the reason why we have to pay more for our food. But when you think about it more, it's just so absurd. The reason why these companies want to do this is because that increases their profits. That allows them to sell more. That allows them to actually sell for a cheaper price.
Straight marketing thing.
It's straight marketing. It's something that makes the product profitable to them. But a person can put their spin on it. I can imagine so many people, watching that video, not giving it a second thought of, oh yeah, these conscious organizations, they're stealing my money. It's those Jews, arguments like that, they can be persuasive to people that aren't really thinking about things.
Most kosher food is bought by people who don't keep kosher.
Mm-hmm.
Because, health food stores, Muslims, stuff like that.
Or just people that aren't looking at all, and someone shows the food they happen to be buying.
People have a view that the extra level of inspection.
Also, some people buy specifically a kosher product without any religious significance. They think it's more helpful.
That's right.
Right.
That's
right.
So health food stores, it sells.
Mm-hmm. So, right, that's the kind of argument you'll see if you look around online, try to find what they're saying about us. But anyways, back to our essay here. One link led me to another, and soon I found myself in Holocaust denial sites. If you followed the David Irving libel suit in the British courts, you're familiar with much of what I saw there. Is anybody familiar with this? This is a little bit before my time. I looked into it a little bit more.
He made the same trip I made.
Huh?
He made the same trip that I made.
What do you mean?
On the internet. It's like exactly the route.
Oh, it brought you into that.
David Irving.
Yeah, so if you look in 1993, David Irving, from what I was reading about this, he was a noted historian until 1993, where Penguin Books, they're a publisher, they put out a book called Denying the Holocaust by Devorah Lipstadt, and there she treats it in a very academic way, Holocaust denial, and she talks about this historian, David Irving, saying he is a Holocaust denier. He distorts facts. He tries to give an impression to the world that there were no gas chambers, that Jews were not killed, not anywhere near 6 million Jews were killed, maybe 100,000 is what he claims, and it's really sickening stuff. And when she made that claim in her book, which was very well founded, David Irving took her to court for libel. He claimed that his reputation was being ruined because of this book. And it had been. And it had been.
He was right.
Publishers were not accepting his work anymore. He was having a very hard time making a living because of the fact that everybody was labeling him now as a Holocaust denier. So he sued Mrs. Lipstadt. And this is one of the few times, Baruch Hashem, where the courts got it right. The British courts, they decided, no, she's absolutely right. You are distorting facts based on the way we're analyzing things, and you have no idea what you're talking about. And with that...
no, it was worse than that. He had every idea what he was talking about.
That he was intentionally distorting facts.
Yeah.
Right. And because of that, he had over $2 million in Penguin Books' legal charges to take care of because he lost the libel suit. Baruch Hashem, he had to file for bankruptcy. He had to sell his very large house. And he has been tremendously discredited. Nobody listens to anything he has to say anymore because of that. But that was one of the few situations in history where people got it right. But the fact that there had to be a trial, the fact that there had to be an inquiry about whether or not he was correct, and they had to analyze his sources and what he was saying.
No, and the fact that he had continued for so long.
Yeah, he got to say it for so long without people.
Until she wrote the book, until his own academic environment. Should have punished him right at the beginning, because he was academically dishonest, he was intellectually dishonest, which is not appropriate for a historian.
He's still not very popular with neo-Nazis and extreme right-wing parties, whatever it is. But he's been largely discredited, thank God. But anyways, according to Holocaust deniers, fewer than 100,000 Jews died in German concentration camps during the war, primarily from disease. There were no gas chambers, no atrocities, no genocide. The statistics are lies. The photographs are fakes. Some of the stones at Auschwitz were tested, they report, and no traces of gas were found, clearly proving that everything was a Jewish hoax, a Zionist plot to gain the sympathy of the Allies and coerce them in giving Palestine to the Jews. The whole Holocaust was nothing more than a ruse by cunning Jews to give the world an undeserved guilt trip. And that's the motive very often when you ask a Holocaust denier, what are they trying to accomplish by discrediting this event in history? They say because, look, the Jews are using that to substantiate their claims that they're in danger, that they need a homeland, etc. And if you try to deny that, you're in many ways denying some of the roots of, let's say, present-day Israel.
In fact, some argue that they colluded with Hitler in order to accomplish this goal.
How so?
The Jews colluded with Hitler.
Oh, interesting.
Sacrificing their own people in order to accomplish the goal.
Amazing what they managed to come up with.
Yeah.
Okay, so as the son of Holocaust survivors, of course, I find Holocaust denial to be nonsense. I am practically a Holocaust survivor myself. I was born just a few years after the war here in New York. My father is the sole survivor of a large rabbinic family from Galicia in southern Poland. His mother, all his brothers and sisters, and all their children perished in the ghettos and the camps. His father died a year before the war. My father was saved only because he was drafted into a forced labor battalion by the retreating Soviet army in 1941. My mother's family in Kiev fared better. They fled to Samarkand in Uzbekistan. My mother's grandfather remained behind in Rushat and Babi Yar. As a child, many of the adults I knew were Holocaust survivors. Years later, I had the privilege of editing a series of personal memoirs called the Holocaust Diaries, and I had occasion to interview many survivors at length. And this is his generation. This was written in the year 2000. He's already, an older adult when he was writing this. My generation, at least, has a much harder time feeling this. That it's, you just lived and breathed it from the people that you interacted with. And, my son is for sure not going to have this. He's going to talk more about that later on in the essay. But no one can deny the Holocaust to me. It is firmly implanted in my memory, and it will be there forever. No one can deny it to my children either, because they too have met and spoken to many survivors. But what about my grandchildren? What about their children? Yesterday, our daughter came to visit us with her adorable 3-year-old and 1-year-old daughters. They are so sweet and innocent, so trusting, and I wondered if they would ever know the extent of the hatred that innumerable people in the world harbor against them just because they're Jewish. They will surely run up against anti-Semitism all too often in their lives, in one form or another. It would be naive to think otherwise. But would they be aware of the depths of inhumanity which our enemies can descend? Would they know about the Holocaust? Would they know that 6 million of their people were brutally slaughtered by murderers with a cultured veneer? It's important to know, part of the resolve that we have, we say never again, requires an appreciation that this happened before. Right?
Dwight Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, told the Signal Corps, who were responsible, the photographers and the filmmakers, that the quote that they have was that he told them to record everything they could of the concentration camps. He said that someday, excuse the language, some son of a bitch will come along
it's your video
and deny that this ever happened. At the time, it was an unbelievable statement. You're standing in the middle of Auschwitz, a liberated Auschwitz, saying someday somebody will come along and say this didn't exist, this didn't happen. Right? But his words were prophetic. Right?
It's true. when we think about, let's say, an Iranian threat nowadays, and you don't need to have an entire, people and culture that are interested in doing this as much as you had in Nazi Germany anymore. You have just one man with a button can make it happen. It's so much more important to realize that humanity can sink that low, and therefore this can happen. It's something to be aware of, something to be afraid of.
The Holocaust is relatively recent in our memories, right? But the previous experiences, the Crusades, Purim, Egypt, right? They're stories to us. And we say at the Haggadah, B'hi Shamda, that in every generation this happens, right? And we're reminded of it painfully in every generation that happens. And again, we're reminded in this generation. But the truth of the matter is our memories are very short. It turns into fairy tales and stories very quickly, this kind of history, even for us.
Absolutely. I think that's the main reason I wanted to read this article with you. I think when you read the Ramban, what he has to say about Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's stories to us. It's hard to, even if we acknowledge that we absolutely believe that it happened, it's still so removed to have something which I think is closer to home, which is what we're looking at here. I think is going to help us in understanding what the Ramban is saying and what we'll get into it, what the nimshal, so to speak, is. So now he continues. It's the first full paragraph on the second column. Imagine a hypothetical scenario, which is unfortunately becoming increasingly less hypothetical. The time is 1 century in the future. Holocaust revisionism is growing. The public is unsure if the Holocaust is historical fact or myth. Germany protests her innocence and offers huge sums for objective research. Scholars painstakingly evaluate the evidence. They cross-reference and check the records for consistency. They examine the photographs in their high-powered microscopes. They review the transcripts of the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials. They read all the books about the alleged Holocaust written during the second half of the 20th century and beyond, and they critically analyze the scholarship. And what is the result? Many scholars proclaim their belief that there was a Holocaust. Others insist that although the evidence is strong, it is not conclusive. How can we actually know it happened, they say? We have no direct evidence, and therefore we can only surmise it. The subject remains unresolved in the academic community, and that is firmly and widely planted in the public mind. The Holocaust is well on its way to becoming a myth. Do you think this could happen?
Yes.
You think so?
It is happening before our eyes.
There's a lot of, I know the younger generation, that they're so me-oriented that they really couldn't care less about anything that's happening in the world because they feel that it doesn't affect them. And when it's taught in schools, some of them, view it as, oh, that happened, it's interesting. But most of them, it's in and out of their head.
Because of that indifference, when you even suggest the idea that there's such a thing as Holocaust denial, and they don't look into it and see how it's total garbage, then they're like, okay.
Because it doesn't affect them, and they couldn't care less.
It's more than that. The British school system now has dropped teaching Holocaust history, which it taught for years and years and years. In the last 2 years, it dropped it completely. It means that British citizens will grow up, right, not knowing whether it was a real thing or not knowing whether it's history or not. That's what they'll grow up believing. And when you consider how the population of Britain is changing and how the hatred of Jews is increasing in Britain, a terrible thing happened in France recently, and it is connected. Holocaust denial, the place where Holocaust denial today is most virile, right, virulent and virile, actually, is in the jihadist world.
Because it's something that helps their agenda.
And that world is spreading through Europe, and one of the things we see is that it's offensive to teach Holocaust history in places today.
Yep. So it could happen. That's what he is suggesting.
The president of Iran denies the Holocaust and then says he wants to finish it, in the same breath.
The anti-Israel elite professors in many universities, I think, are also poisoning the minds of young people so that anything that is sympathetic to Jews, they don't want to believe. There's a book that just was published a week ago called Battle for Our Minds, Western Elites and the Terror Threat by Professor Michael Wodlansky, who teaches at Bar-Ilan. It just came out. And he names names. Some of the professors in elite universities in the United States, what they're teaching. And Columbia's has some of them, and as you know, the President of the United States attended that school, although we don't have his transcripts. Professor Wadlinski suspects that he attended some of the classes of these people, was influenced by them. And the President of the United States' former minister is participating in a march, sort of an anti-Israel march.
This Friday, right? That one?
And this is the man who was the mentor who married the President and his wife, and the President sat in the pews and listened to his sermons for 20 years, and this man is openly...
This is the same one that made all those horrible comments, Reverend Wright. Yeah? Okay, that guy. All right. So, yeah, falsehood can be popularized. It can make its way around. But anyway, so it continues.
Today...
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
But, today there's a tremendous attempt to equate Israel with Nazi Germany.
It's another can of worms.
It's an absolute despicable scandal, but it's reasonably effective.
Yeah. It's propaganda. Okay, so ridiculous, you say. How can a preponderance of evidence be denied? Thought this was an interesting mashal. Well, we don't have to go much further than the O.J. Simpson trial for the answer. O.J. did not claim temporary insanity or mitigating circumstances. His defense was outright denial, and he pulled it off. Was he guilty? How can I know? Today there are many people who are convinced he is guilty, but a century from now, they probably will be few and far between. All people will know is that doubt was established and that he was given the benefit of the doubt. This is also something that was a little bit before my time, but I read a bit about it. It sounds absurd that there was a high-speed car chase after they realized that he was perhaps guilty, and there was DNA evidence, which they didn't really know what that meant back then. But O.J.'s lawyers managed to constantly insert enough doubt to help him out in that. After the trial was over, they polled African Americans and whites about what they thought, and there was a tremendous discrepancy between the two groups as to whether they thought O.J. was guilty or not guilty. And I think anybody that looks in retrospect and thinks about what DNA evidence actually is and understands what it means nowadays, it's very hard, and that's why he lost the civil trial. That's why all these things happen. But there was this idea that when you implant doubt, it gives people the ability to say the things that they want to say, even when they go against the facts. That's basically... One
of the main mistakes was the glove.
The glove issue, right? The glove didn't fit, is what one of the jurors said.
You must acquit.
That was one of the major mistakes.
All right. So anyway, so what about my great-great-grandchildren who will be living 100 years from now? I don't realistically expect to be around to set them straight, so what will they think? How will they know that the Holocaust really happened? For one thing, they will have the benefit of the Jewish transferal process. We Jewish people have a great talent for transferring knowledge into the future with an incredible accuracy. It happens that I am descended on my mother's side from the Baal Shem Tov, the 18th century mystic who founded the Hasidic movement in the Ukraine. The Baal Shem Tov had a lifelong desire to immigrate to the Holy Land, but when he passed away in 1760, he was still in the Ukraine. About 20 years earlier, he had actually attempted the journey, but he got only as far as the Greek Isles. A close brush with death persuaded him to turn back. The Baal Shem Tov reached safety in Constantinople on the last day of Passover, and in gratitude to the Almighty, he thenceforth made a feast of thanksgiving at that time every year. He also instructed that his descendants for 10 generations do so as well. I am a 9th generation descendant, and in my family we observe this hallowed custom scrupulously. Every year, ever since I can remember, we gather around a food-laden table in the synagogue or in the home of a family member at the close of Passover, and we retell the story of the Baal Shem Tov's providential deliverance from a storm at the sea. This past Passover, it was my turn to host the Baal Shem Tov Suda for my family. I also invited a number of friends and neighbors. I told the story to a rapt audience, and afterwards we sang and talked and ate, not necessarily in that order. It was beautiful, as always. The story is exactly as I heard it from my grandfather every year until he passed away 35 years ago at the age of 80. He had heard the story from his father-in-law some 60 years earlier. We have already jumped 1 century into the past. Now my great-grandfather heard the story from his own great-grandfather, from his grandfather, who heard it from Rabbi Baruch of Medjugorje, the Baal Shem Tov's grandson, who heard it directly from the Baal Shem Tov every year as he was growing up. In the nearly 3 centuries since the story took place, it passed through 4 trustworthy hands between the Baal Shem Tov and me, as it also did along hundreds of parallel lines of descent. I and the thousands of other descendants of the Baal Shem Tov who have received this tradition know that the Baal Shem Tov told this story at his table in the waning hours of Passover every single year after he returned to the Ukraine, as surely as if we had been sitting there ourselves. The story itself we have to believe, but we know for a fact that the Baal Shem Tov told this particular story at that particular time. Just you see where he's going with this, but I just can tell you a caveat. Anybody ever hear of the Baal Shem Tov story? the whole Misa. It's a whole thing. But anyways, if you actually look into it, if you do your research about it, there are different accounts of what happened. Details in the story are changed. So I don't know if one could say that there is in fact a one uniform, perfect story of the Baal Shem Tov's journey.
She views it as hers.
What?
She views it as hers. He views it as his mother's.
Oh. Okay.
Right? That's the perfect one.
But the idea of a story being given over constantly, so from generation to generation, that's what he's drawing on. And I think the nimshal that he's going to bring this to is where there's going to be perhaps a lot more accuracy to be talked about. Anyways, my grandchildren will know that the Holocaust took place because they will hear about it from their parents and teachers, who will have heard about it from their parents and teachers. Is this called knowing? It is. How do we know anything to be true? There are essentially two ways: direct observation and second-hand knowledge. Most of what we know is from second-hand knowledge. If we were to limit ourselves to direct observation, we would know nothing of history or science or just about anything else. We would not rely on textbooks or information we hear from others. If we undergo an operation, how would we know the surgeon had gone to medical school? When we board a plane, how would we know that the pilot had been trained to fly? We put our lives on the line without direct knowledge that it is safe to do so. Clearly, we must accept some second-hand knowledge in order to be able to function as normal human beings. This is how we live our lives. Anybody that denies the fact that we use second-hand knowledge regularly is being absurd. It's just the way we live. But still, we cannot be gullible. So how do we determine if we should give credibility to second-hand knowledge? Since we have no way of making a direct evaluation, we must do it by inference. Either the information is true or it is false. If we can show it is unreasonable to consider it false, then it is reasonable to consider it true. If it is unreasonable to believe the pilot is an imposter, then it is reasonable to step onto the plane. So let us consider. Why would second-hand knowledge be false? There are a few possibilities. This is key. The provider of the information may be ignorant or mistaken or a liar. If we can eliminate these possibilities, then it is reasonable to assume that the information is true. It's easy to deal with the issue of ignorance or mistakes, right? The first two. We just need to determine if the provider has the intelligence to get it right. If the information is simple, we can trust the average person. If it's more complex, then we would feel more confident with the testimony of an expert. If a person told you it rained yesterday, you would not think he was mistaken. But if he told you there had been an atmospheric inversion, I have no idea what that is, you would want to know if he's a meteorologist. The issue of credibility, however, is thornier. How can we be sure information has not been deliberately fabricated? One of the strongest proofs is to hear the same information from many sources. If one person was to tell me that a train was derailed in Nebraska, I might be somewhat doubtful. But if I heard it from many people, and in all the news stations, I would accept it as having happened. We do not assume that there are universal conspiracies to fool us unless we suffer from acute paranoia. This then is how we determine the reliability of second-hand knowledge.
Of course, today that's much more dangerous.
What?
Today that's much more dangerous.
So?
Because there's a tendency for news organizations to pool their information.
Right. The one person's copying from one central...
And very often you see that if there's a mistake made, it's a tremendous embarrassment because the mistake is made by the London Times and the New York Times.
Absolutely. I know one situation that happened in this community where a newspaper took a story that happened locally and spun it in a ridiculous direction, at which point every other major newspaper took from what they had said, and that was... that was what they did. It's interesting. So yes, in today's world,
it's much more
in an era of copy and paste.
Yeah.
You can imagine how it's a little bit more. Wikipedia.
Right. Wikipedia gets it wrong. A lot of people.
In some ways, Wikipedia has almost its own system of checks and balances sometimes, and that's if there's enough of an agenda, then even that could get bypassed. But there's people that will call each other on facts. So where's your reference for that, etc.
They developed that there were a lot of mistakes.
There's plenty. That's every college professor demands that their students not use Wikipedia for a research project.
The movie stars always find out that they died, so they have to do a press release saying, "I'm not dead." Sorry.
That's how these things happen. So yeah, in the I guess age of information, you have to be more careful. But anyways, going further. This then is how we determine the reliability of second-hand knowledge. Simple information from many sources is true. Complex information from a single inexpert source is most likely untrue. Anything that falls into the gray areas in between is subject to varying degrees of doubt. Therefore, if countless Jewish people testify that there was a Holocaust, we can safely accept it as reliable second-hand knowledge. They cannot all be lying. And I think, in many ways, there are a lot of organizations that are trying to essentially get multiple testimonies. Yad Vashem, I think, has a whole series of interviews where they're trying to say, these are the voices of all the people that
Spielberg
experience.
has a history of it. He has a video history of it.
I think something in the UK they're doing also now. Similarly, that's essentially the goal of making sure that even in generations to come, using media, that there is a constant message from many people that this happened.
Yeah.
But okay, therefore, admittedly, this may not be proof for a German youngster who is predisposed to disbelieve the Holocaust. He has no problem claiming that all the Jews who are part of this transferal process are liars and villains. Germans have accused Jews of worse things and attempted to exterminate all of us. So, some people live lives where there's so much, simple information from many sources being shoved down their throat, but that their lies to begin with, which is what you mentioned, that there is this ability for that to happen. But my grandchildren will know that Jews are wonderful people, and they will know that the transferal process is reliable and has been proved to be exceedingly accurate. This in the part that in the print that I gave you earlier, this next part is not in there. I took it out to make it shorter. But for example, take the idea of genealogies, which are quite popular today. We have been keeping genealogical records for millennia. Jews in particular, he's talking about. Thousands and thousands of Jewish people can trace their ancestors for hundreds of years until they link up with some of the recorded lineages that lead all the way back to biblical times. I can do this on my father's side and my mother's. Please look at the old genealogies in Jerba, Tunisia, and all the other genealogies on record in the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv. They go back thousands of years. When Queen Elizabeth's ancestors were illiterate savages in the German forests, thousands of our people had distinguished genealogies as long as my arm. And they are clearly not inventions because they are so intertwined with each other. To fabricate all of them so that they will be consistent with each other would have required a vast diabolical plot supported by a good mainframe computer at the least. And I think for time purposes we can skip the next two paragraphs. He talks about how genealogies were important for the kahuna, for marriage. He talks about the Kohen gene that was discovered and what that might mean. So anyways, let's go to the first full paragraph on the next page. We also know the teacher-to-teacher transferal process, which has been documented conscientiously throughout history all the way back to biblical times. I refer you to Raphael Halpern's Atlas Atzei Chaim in Hebrew. It is impossible not to be impressed by all those pages of tables and charts presenting the continuity of the teaching process through the ages in minute detail. Unfortunately, the teacher-to-teacher process cannot be confirmed by a common gene in the soul. But if you look, there's Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman. He has a number of books, Permission to Believe, Permission to Receive, about the authenticity of the getting of the Torah at Sinai. But also he has something about the oral Torah. And he has a long chart from him all the way till Moshe Rabbeinu, of his Rebbe and his Rebbe's Rebbe and his Rebbe's Rebbe. We kept track of these things. We know that there's a certain value to genealogies, and with that there's a link to the Masorah and an understanding that we have that link. So just continuing. Let's see. We could. This is interesting. We, the Jewish people, have always been very focused on genealogy. A large part of the Bible is devoted to names and relationships. Read the first book of Chronicles. The Gemara identifies Avraham's mother as Amaslia, the daughter of Carnabo. There is no mention of this name in the Bible, and yet the Jewish transferal process preserved it orally for 1,500 years. Bible critics laughed this name off as pure invention, and they proved their case by the absence of a name such as Carnabo in any Babylonian records. It's always a dangerous thing, to deny something because of a lack of evidence to it, because you inevitably find that evidence, something with regards to, let's say, Hilchos Pesach. So there is a large discussion about whether or not Shibboleth Shual, in the Mishnah, one of the 5 grains that can become chametz, we typically translate it as oats, and that was called into question by certain historians looking at Jewish archaeological digs, not finding any evidence of oats being used in any kind of context. But then, sure enough, they found it. If you think about charoses is part of the recipe is tapuchim, right, which we translate as what?
Yep.
Apples.
Yeah.
Until the 1950s, there was in academia there was a movement to say, well, you don't find any evidence of apples being grown in Israel, wherever they thought apples came from, not from Israel. They didn't think it was there, so they found it very hard to believe that was part of the recipe, or where anytime tapuchim are described in Tanakh, that it means apples. They thought it meant either, I think, the quince was a fruit that they had suggested it might be, or something else. But sure enough, they found archaeological records later that Romans, I think, uprooted all the apple trees from Israel. So there's a lot of danger in saying that, I know this is not true because I don't see any archaeological record of it that proves so.
That makes an assumption about archaeologists that one shouldn't make.
Right. So, lo and behold, archaeologists have since discovered new Babylonian records in Ebla that mention the name Carnival as a royal family name. You say you would be fascinated by, he's quoting the other individual, Amiel Hirsch, you say you would be fascinated by archaeological proof of Avraham's existence. How about archaeological support of Avraham's grandfather's existence? Does that do anything for you? Okay. And this is also crucial. And what about the accuracy of our Torah scrolls? Some years ago, a comparison was made of extant manuscript copies of the Christian Bible reproduced by monks over the centuries. They discovered 150,000 variations. Of these, fully 400 affected the meaning of the text, and 50 actually resulted in important differences. I remember there was the first edition of the King James Bible. I think they forgot the word "not." Thou shalt commit adultery. Was one of the translations they obviously knew that was a mistake, but you see how mistakes can creep in. Anyways, we can assume this was not intentional, just the natural error factor resulting from 1,000 years of the laborious copying and recopying in dusty monastery scriptoria. In startling contrast, an examination of Torah scrolls from all over the world, from Ireland to Siberia to isolated Yemen, all handwritten by scribes, right? Because that's a halakha in Sefer Torah; they have to be handwritten. Yielded just 9 instances of one letter spelling discrepancies. 9! And none of them affect the meaning of the text. Why is this so? Because every week we take out the scrolls and read them in public. The people follow the reading closely, and if something is wrong, they are quick to point it out. Because we know, any self-respecting shul you go to, there are people in the Valkyrie's case, they yell at him at every minor mistake. Usually, in halakha, you don't usually have to do that. Only if there's a change in the meaning of what's being said, and most people don't know Hebrew well enough to know when that's the case. But anyways, think about it. Here were monks sitting in the security and serenity of their scriptoria, trying to be accurate and faithful to the original, which is only half the size of the Torah, and still they produced over 100,000 variations. At the same time, we oppressed and persecuted Jews, whose books were so often confiscated and incinerated, managed to reproduce our scrolls with near-perfect accuracy in far-flung communities that were not in touch with each other. What does this tell us about the integrity of our transferal process? What does this tell us about the Jewish people?
He's being a little bit unfair here.
How so?
Because the whole concept of transferring the Torah and Tanakh, for that matter, is very different than the transfer of virtually anything in the ancient world, even our own commentaries.
In what way?
In that it was normal that the people doing the writing would make their own commentaries in the writing. It was considered appropriate to do. They were not just simply scribes, but they actually were learned people who would insert their own commentary as part of the document. Right? And one of the reasons we have Rashi script is to understand that that's commentary and not Torah. Actually, there is no such thing.
There's a lot of variant texts in Rashi that are usually attributed to the fact that one of Rashi's students wrote in his own margins a different approach or something like that.
That's right.
And then somehow that became Rashi also.
That's right. And see, but that actually was the norm in the ancient world and medieval world to do that. Right? It wasn't considered to be misleading because nobody really thought what they were reading was the next generation of the idea. We hold that there is no next generation. There's only one generation of Torah, one generation of Tanakh. And so we devote tremendous emphasis to the accuracy of the reproduction.
I mean, you for sure can say that the reason why they had so many mistakes is because they viewed things very differently in terms of their text. Right, but if we're talking about our text specifically, we want to talk about the reliability of what we have.
Right, I'm saying our style of transmission of this kind of information is very different. Right, we're most concerned with accuracy. And part of it is because we believe this to be the actual Word of God.
Right, we take this very seriously.
So, we're not qualified to change the Word of God. Right? Whereas if it's even the word of an apostle, of whatever, right? There's room to say, well, this is what his intent was, and actually write it in his words.
There's also the aspect of translations, which they had, where we try to stay faithful to the original text. Right? See, I don't think what he's trying to get at is, look, these people make so much more mistakes than us. It's they look at their system in a different way. We view our system in a way that you can really have a lot of integrity to the original text. For sure, I think that's what he's trying to say. In terms of our transferal process, we take the original very seriously, the Masorah, the ability to link back to previous sources, to earlier authorities. That's something that's crucial. So when I speculate about how our grandchildren will be affected by Holocaust denial, I can be sure that they will not consider it a Jewish myth. But how much will they really know? How much will they really believe? I can just hear them talking. Sure, there was a Holocaust, but the information might have become somewhat exaggerated over the years. Were there actually 6 million victims? Were old people, women, children actually killed in gas chambers? Can it really be true that Nazi officers smashed babies' heads against the walls and then went back to their quarters to listen to Mozart? Did Nazi doctors really do all sorts of ghastly medical experiments on young Jewish twins? Come on, something bad must have happened. But do you expect us to believe all these outlandish stories? So how do we convince them? What can we possibly do to make sure our descendants never forget the Holocaust in all its horrid detail? Only one sort of evidence is truly convincing: the testimony of many witnesses. Modern technology has shown us that documents, photographs, and even videos can be falsified. But the testimony of witnesses will always have credibility. Everything can be disputed except for testimony. If there had been 5 witnesses to the Nicole Simpson murder, the person they accused, OJ or otherwise, would most probably have been convicted. So a very important principle in ADIS. I mean, it deserves to be analyzed, the concept of ADIS, because in the same way that testimony can be very trustworthy in one way, it's also just takes 2 people to get together and try to make up a lie, and they could get away with it potentially. There's a system that the BAYT has called Drisha Bechakira. There's examination very closely, putting the guys in separate rooms to see if they have the same story. So there's what to talk about in terms of Jewish law, but it's a key idea right here that's coming across. Testimony is crucial. Hearing Holocaust survivors, hundreds of thousands of them, tell the story of their experiences, hearing their solemn testimony, that is truly compelling. You cannot listen to so many people telling the same gruesome story and think they are lying or mistaken. Not if they are your own people. Not if you consider the Jewish people credible. But nearly 60 years have passed since the Holocaust. I read in the New York Times that Israeli government figures show that there are only 230,000 survivors left in Israel, and 20,000 have died since 1997. This article was written in 2000. You can imagine the numbers are much lower now. The Times gave no figures for the rest of the world, but you get the picture. Within a decade or 2, hardly any living survivors of the Holocaust will remain. There will be no one left to give testimony, and the wheels of outright Holocaust denial or revisionism will move into higher gear. Since our descendants will not hear the testimony of survivors, how can we preserve for them the integrity of the Holocaust record? Before we get into the next part, which is where things get very interesting. So one way that we're doing it is Yad Vashem is videos, right? Video interviews and other organizations, right? That's what we're trying to do. The testimony of everybody's story, and whether or not that can actually stand the test of time remains to be seen. You can imagine in some way or another, there will be an attempt to discredit it. But that's what we're working on right now. But years ago I read about a proposal that would work if it could be implemented. It goes as follows. I think this is tongue-in-cheek what he's saying, but interesting nonetheless. All the Holocaust survivors and their children are brought together from all over the world for an international convention. Difficult logistically, but possible. A major statement that gives a detailed account of the Holocaust experience is read in public in front of all the survivors, and they all bear witness to its truth and accuracy. This forms the essence of the testimony, which will henceforth be called the Shoah Manifesto. All the survivors and their children form an organization called the Shoah Society. The purpose of this society is to perpetuate the testimony of their survivors, to keep it alive and immediate as it was on the day it was given. The members of the society accept a set of rules. Every week, society members congregate to pay their respects to the victims and to read sections of the Shoah Manifesto aloud. 3 times a year, all society members conduct special ceremonies. During the Festival of Liberation, they commemorate the day the survivors were liberated by eating tiny crusts of bread, as they did in the camps, and reading the manifesto. During the Festival of Ships, they all leave their homes and live on boats to commemorate the experiences of the displaced persons that emigrated to Israel and the United States after the Holocaust. You're probably starting to see where this is going. During the Festival of the Formation of the Society, they gather in meeting halls and read the entire manifesto in public.
All night long.
All night long. Every child born into the Shoah Society has a blue number tattooed on his right forearm. As he grows up, he is taught to read the manifesto until it becomes very familiar to him. Members of the society, who are to be known as Shoah witnesses, are forbidden to marry out of the society in order to maintain the integrity of their mission. If someone wants to join the society, he can, as long as he accepts all its rules. Shoah witnesses wear yellow jute stars on their outer garments, and they use no products manufactured in Germany. They also affix scrolls containing important parts of the manifesto in tubes wrapped in barbed wire to their doorposts. Finally, each Shoah witness participates in producing a handwritten scroll of the manifesto, which is considered a major fulfillment of his mission. The rules are precise and cannot be violated. Should someone insist on wearing a pink jute star instead of a yellow one, for instance, he would be ejected from the society. The rules clearly call for a yellow star. The formation of the Shoah Society and all its rules are written into the manifesto itself, together with a cardinal rule that the manifesto may never be altered either by addition or subtraction. The manifesto also calls for and describes the distribution process. Handwritten copies on parchment are to be made for every geographical group of survivors to take home with them, and they are enjoined to make more copies when they come home, thereby giving the manifesto as wide a distribution as possible among the Shoah witnesses. In addition, the manifesto instructs that it be inscribed in its entirety on a large marble slab, so that the Shoah witnesses can check the accuracy of their scrolls in the intermediate period during which the scroll is reproduced and distributed throughout the world. All this is to safeguard its integrity. Anybody have any idea what the nimshal is for that last paragraph?
Inscribing it on stone?
Inscribing on stone? Not the luchos. If you're thinking of the luchos, we're talking about the entire, so to speak, manifesto. So
Crossing the Yarden?
Yes, across the Yarden. Moshe Rabbeinu, not Moshe Rabbeinu, Yeshua, had it that there were a number of different copies of the Torah engraved on stone. The manifesto is completed and distributed according to the instructions inscribed within it. The living testimony of the survivors is now encapsulated in the manifesto and preserved for the ages. Over the years, many descendants of the survivors leave the society, but many others remain true to the mission of their ancestors. 100 years later, there are millions of Shoah witnesses living in every corner of the world. Their copies of the manifesto, millions of them, are identical, and the Shoah witnesses themselves are instantly recognizable to each other by their customs and traditions. The system is tight. There is no room for falsification. When could such a lie have been introduced? How could they have gotten so many people to assume the mantle of Shoah witnesses and to champion a manifesto that is clearly untrue? Granted, the testimony of the Shoah witnesses proves there was a Holocaust, but does it prove all the details are true? Of course it does, because the Shoah witnesses testify not only to the Holocaust itself, but also to the creation of the Shoah manifesto during the lifetime of the survivors, with their approval and its distribution to all of them. From that point on, the manifesto speaks for itself, since its credentials as the genuine testimony of the survivors has been established. From that point on, whoever reads the manifesto hears the courageous, pain-filled voices of the survivors speaking to him, clearly across the chasm of years, centuries, and millennia. Quite a creative idea, wouldn't you say? Obviously, we will never see anything of this sort take place. And he goes on to talk about, as you can imagine, the nimshal. But I think you could leave that to yourself. It's pretty obvious. Tell me, would you become a Shoah witness if you were presented with this, plan, this program? I wouldn't. Anybody else?
I have a problem with the tattoo.
Okay.
Well,
but why not?
It would help a lot if God played a role in it.
Okay. But if it wasn't, if it was just about the fact that this historical incident took place, you probably wouldn't do it. Why?
I think it sort of isolate, and we're not. It sort of isolates them as a separate group.
Rather than a member of the Jewish.
Throughout everything, throughout history, it's like the Jewish people as one. Mm-hmm. We came out of Egypt. We don't say our ancestors came out. We came out of Egypt.
So you're talking about loyalties to a different group that would prevent you from doing this.
No, I think it's, as well as teaching, it kind of separates the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. You have like two groups. One that is going to continue this, and one... Let's say it wasn't for. Let's say that reason was not a problem. Let's say every Jew theoretically had agreed to do this.
I think the difference is that at the time that the Shoah happens, mm-hmm. The year, let's say 1950, just after the Shoah, right? Nobody believes there's a need for it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely nobody believes there's. Nobody can imagine that. It's at a stage where many people won't buy Japanese or German products at all. Not just Jews. Nobody will, because of, they were the enemy. Right? Everybody kind of has an understanding of that, right? The problem is that by the time you realize that there's a danger that it will be forgotten, and we should join the society, it's probably too late.
Okay, that's a theoretical issue.
Because if you asked me in 1950 would I join the society, right? I would say there's no need. Nobody's going to forget this, right? If you ask me in the year 2010 when I joined the society, it seems to me that I would say, well, you're going to have to rely on documentary evidence now. Mm-hmm. It's too late.
There's another. I think that's another external issue. Let's say we had all the. Let's say you knew the future. You had the wisdom to understand what people would try to do years from now. And you're living at.
I would join the society.
You would.
I would, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. In that situation, I would shoot.
Even though the tattoo is not permitted to us.
Well, that's
Okay, that's another, I think, external issue.
We're assuming that this is a muscle for something else.
I personally wouldn't. I'll tell you why. I feel like this is, we want to give testimony to this event, granted. If what it takes to make sure that there's a memory of this event, implanted in the minds of the world, and that it's never forgotten, requires me turning my life upside down in the way that's being proposed here. I personally, the Holocaust is certainly a very heavy thing. I'm not denying that, but for it to define my life, I would find that very difficult. There's there's a very important message that it contains. It's something that we want to know about.
It's a misunderstanding. Keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive is not about remembering the Holocaust.
Okay, yeah, the message is about, which is
it's about preventing it next time.
Absolutely.
Right? That's what it's all about. It's about preventing the next Holocaust. It's not about remembering the Holocaust. In fact, it's about prevention of the future.
To the extent that it's remembered,
right.
Does that guarantee that this will never happen again? I don't think it does.
Interestingly enough, I think that it has a very powerful effect to prevent it from happening again. And in order for things like the position of the current Iranian government to exist, anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial has to begin to play a major role. When there was a vivid memory of this despicable history in which the entire world took part in it, in one way or another, either as executors themselves or people who decided to look the other way, right? There was a memory that an evil was perpetrated and was allowed to happen, and it should not happen again. Right? In order for it to happen again, you have to begin to say, those who were the victims were really the cause of it, and they are now acting like the perpetrators, and it really never happened the way they said it did, and now we can do it to them again. You actually have to go through that process, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we are today.
That is where we are today. Right. Absolutely.
So I think that the remembering the Holocaust, we should never forget one Jew who dies. Right? But the whole effort to remember the Holocaust as an event has clearly been an effort to prevent it from repeating itself. Never again is what its real raison d'etre is. It's not just simply we visit a gravesite.
There's a purpose to remembering this, to be sure.
Yeah. So and I think that purpose is not so different than the purpose of the existence of Judaism. If you allow the Holocaust to happen again, heaven forbid, right, then you may put an end to the venture itself. God will not let that happen. We know what our history is, right? But we have our role in preventing it as well. Right? So I think that the whole question of, Holocaust denial is not like a separate field, right? It is actually intrinsic to the survival of Judaism and the prevention of continuing efforts to destroy the Jewish people, right? And you can see that it's failing.
Yeah, I agree.
It's failing, and it's part of, I guess, why some people become more religious, because we can see the historical process of using the Holocaust to prevent the world from doing this again seems not to be working.
Do you feel like the videos, the interviews of survivors, that's going to accomplish I guess?
No, I don't.
Perpetuating its memory, so why not?
No, I don't. I think what's happened is that it's becoming a more and more distant memory. And things. Listen, I'm older than you are, but I'm not ancient, right? And things that could never have been said in good company
that can be said
25, 30 years ago, not only can be said, but they're said by leaders of governments, by heads of state. And I'm not talking about enemy states. In theory, allies can speak this way publicly, and little by little you get to the point where you can dehumanize another individual. And as soon as you can dehumanize another individual, you can eradicate him like you do a bug. And we know that the tragedy of the German story was that the same people were very caring about their pets. They would do these terrible things to Jewish babies.
They managed to...
Right? They managed to separate them from human beings. You know, and it's a process you go through. It says this is part of the description of what Paro did to us in Egypt. Was that we would be seen...
There was like we learned a number of weeks ago, there was a way of, I guess, implanting in the Egyptian mind the idea that these people, though not having actually done anything wrong, they were the enemy, but they were a threat to the well-being of the Egyptian nation. And you see, we talked about that in Parshas Shemos. We talked about how that was
the greatest danger to peace in the world today is the state of Israel. That's what poll after poll says, right? Not Iran. You know, who says they're going to do it? You know, it's Israel, right?
The value of remembering the Holocaust.
I rest my case.
Yeah, is important, to be sure.
I think it's important. I think it's important to the Jewish people that they educate their children and their grandchildren and whatever to know that this horrible thing has happened and we have to protect ourselves and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Because anti-Semitism has never died, has never gone away. It's always there. And sometimes it's more in your face than other times, but it's always there. So when the world is a more comfortable place, it rears its ugly head. And when things are, we have to be more careful, so it goes down a little bit more. But it's always there. And I think the Holocaust, because it's in our time, we have to make sure that we ourselves, the Jewish people, for our own sake, know that it's happened and that this is something that we have to do our very best to prevent it, do our part.
5 years ago, there was a tremendous effort to separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism.
Still today, it's
and anti-Zionism was not a good thing, but it was a political position people took. And anti-Semitism was bad. There is no separation of it anymore. People lump the two together constantly. Look at the news.
There are a lot of people, I think, that twist that and make the distinction.
No, that distinction is becoming grayer and grayer and grayer.
Yeah, it's becoming grayer.
There's no question about it. The idea that Hezbollah, right? A Lebanese, Iranian puppet group, right? Is acting against Jews everywhere in the world without regard to Zionist intentions. Tells you something, right? That they believe it is a politically acceptable thing to do.
Exactly. In fact,
and they're right.
Yeah. If we all remember the Entebbe incident, when the plane was hijacked, the terrorists did not say that only Israelis would be held and everybody else was freed. They said all non-Jews could be freed, and all the Jews, whether they were Israelis or they were not Israelis, were kept prisoner in Entebbe.
You know who was famously on that ship on the plane?
On the plane, right?
Do you know who was there?
Big pardon?
Do you know who was famously on the plane?
Who was on the plane?
Rafudner, I believe. Yeah.
In Entebbe?
I think so. Am I thinking of something else?
It's a different hijacking.
Different hijacking?
Yeah, he was on another plane. You're right. But it was hijacked and landed, I think, in Jordan.
But despite this, the world didn't seem to be, at least the media, didn't seem to want to recognize the anti-Semitism in the world, and they still treated it as though it was an anti-Israel incident, even though there were all kinds of non-Israelis being held there by these terrorists.
At the end of the day, this is an interesting topic, and the Shoah and anti-Semitism as a whole is certainly, as you can see, there's a lot of discussion. At the end of the day, Yosef Reinman, he wants to use this as a mashal. Essentially, he wants to say if there's another idea, which is very important, that it's certainly worth developing a system of witnesses of a culture, to continue the memory of a certain experience, and to have so many different practices that are related to reinforcing this message, and that's Judaism. So remembering what happened when we left Egypt.
Yeah, tattoo is nothing compared to circumcision. I'm serious.
It's true.
No, I'm serious.
If you look in the Ramban, we're not going to do it inside because of the lack of time. Ramban says there's a tremendously powerful idea that comes out of Yetzias Mitzrayim, that there are people that used to think the world was eternal, that there was no creator, or that there was a God that had created it, that he doesn't, but he left it alone after he made it, or that he knows what's going on, but he doesn't get involved. You have an episode where people needs help, and all of a sudden miraculous things are done to save them, where there's clear intervention of nature, or at least in a natural way, amazing timing in terms of saving the Jewish people, that communicates to the world a very important message. There's a God. He created the world. He knows what's going on. He's involved in it on a regular basis. He's overseeing it. That is essentially the message of Judaism, that God is supposed to be worshipped and appreciated for what he's done, what he continues to do. That is the core message of Judaism, and that is why we have so many mitzvahs that are Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that we go crazy over. If a person doesn't bring Karban Pesach, they're chayav kares. If they eat chametz, they're chayav kares. There's some, like when you're cleaning your house and you're going crazy with all sorts of things that we do, we tend to lose the focus as to why we do them. Why do we say Kriya Shema, the third paragraph, every morning and night? Why do we do so many other mitzvahs that are Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kiddush, not just on Pesach, on Shabbos, on the holidays? The holidays themselves are all Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. Everything that we not everything, but so many of the mitzvahs that we do are meant to remind us of these instances in history, because they have a very powerful message to teach us. And then when you think coming into the Seder, if that's going to be the time of Yigalut Lemincha, that's going to be the time in which you transmit the message to the next generation, or at least reinforce it within yourself. And I think this brings it home as to how powerful and how important it is. And that's, I think, what the Ramban would have to say. So, why do we have a Seder? Why do we have so many mitzvahs that are Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim? He sums it up as follows, and I think just, looking at an episode in history that's closer to home, that we understand more, that we understand the need to keep its memory alive, I think shows us, what the function is of all these mitzvahs, and how they play an extremely important role, and the fact that they're so pervasive in terms of our lives. It's for good reason. It's because the message which it's supposed to communicate to us, if we think about each and every mitzvah that we do, it's a hard task, but if we think about it, it gives us a message which is supposed to guide our entire lives, which is extremely important. With that, have a good day. Thank you for coming.